All right, so now we're going to think about some possible offsets to fiscal policy, and this kind of answers the first question that we saw in the last section, whether or not the government would have to spend the full amount of the recessionary gap. So as it turns out, right, not surprisingly, fiscal policy doesn't happen in a vacuum, so to speak, and so some important questions have to be answered. The first is, how are these government expenditures financed, and who is financing them? And then another question is, if taxes are increased, right, perhaps to finance these expenditures, what does government do with the taxes? And what will happen if individuals worry about future taxes increasing? So these are all important questions, right, that have to be answered in thinking about these issues. So kind of getting to one of the issues involving government expenditure is this so-called crowding out effect. And this is basically the tendency of expansionary fiscal policy to cause decreases in other planned investment or planned consumption in the economy. So in that sense, when the government spends money, it's possible that it is sort of forcing out or crowding out expenditures in other components of GDP, such as consumption or investment. And so this decrease in consumption or decrease in investment coming from an increase in government spending is usually the result of an increase in interest rates. And the reason for this is because very frequently the government finances its expenditures by borrowing money. And by borrowing money, it's increasing the demand for loanable funds, right? So recall back to our loanable funds market, where there's the supply of loanable funds and the demand for loanable funds. Well, when the government borrows money, it's increasing the demand. And if it's increasing the demand for loanable funds, what happens to the price of borrowing money, or the interest rate? It goes up. And if the interest rate goes up, it basically becomes more expensive for consumers and businesses to borrow money, and therefore it crowds out consumption and investment. Okay, so this is kind of the progression of steps for crowding out, right? So government spending exceeds tax revenues, which means it needs to borrow money because of a decrease or an increase in the deficit. And it funds this deficit by borrowing money from savers. And in order to induce these savers to provide them the money, the government has to basically provide them with a higher interest rate. And as a result of the higher interest rate, this affects the interest rate in the market for loanable funds overall. And so since interest rates go up, borrowing money becomes more expensive, which means consumers borrow less money for consumption and investors borrow less money for investment. And it crowds those things out. All right, so basically here we go again. We've got our recessionary gap here. We start in equilibrium 1. The government spends money to get us back to the long-run equilibrium, but because of some crowding out, it doesn't quite make it all the way there. Okay, consumption, or rather aggregate demand, gets crowded out in terms of consumption and investment, and we don't quite make it all the way back. Okay, so we're seeing that, yeah, the government actually might have to spend more than the recessionary gap here in order to get us back to long-run equilibrium. Okay, so there's another issue known as the Ricardian equivalence theorem that sort of is an offset to increased expenditure, government expenditure. And the idea here is that an increase in the government budget deficit, right, which, by the way, the budget deficit basically means a deficit is when the government spends more money than it's bringing in taxes. So it's spending more money than it has in terms of taxes. And so this theorem suggests that an increase in this budget deficit basically has no effect on aggregate demand. And the reason for this is that as the government spends more money than it has, people like you and me anticipate that we will have to pay higher taxes in the future as a result of this. And because of that, we save our money today to pay those higher taxes in the future. And as the result of saving that money today, we decrease our consumption. And so there's literally, according to this theory, no effect on GDP as a result of the government increasing its spending beyond its means, because we, as the taxpayer, anticipate that means that in the future we'll have to pay higher taxes, and so we save our money today by reducing our consumption. And so this is basically theorizing that there's an exactly equal offset. So any money that the government spends above and beyond what it raises in taxes is directly offset by what we as taxpayers save by consuming less. There's another hypothesis theory called the permanent income hypothesis. And it's basically this hypothesis that asserts that an individual's current consumption depends on their anticipated lifetime income. And so to explain this further, it basically means that, as we go on through our lives, our income as we get older generally goes up as we gain more education and experience. And then at some point we retire and our income declines. And so we kind of have like a hill-shaped income over our lifespan. And we act as consumers. We try to basically smooth out our consumption over that. So when we're young and we are not making a lot of money, we tend to borrow money. And then as we get older and start to make more money, we start to pay off those debts. And then as we get even older and head into retirement, we eat into our savings, right? Our retirement savings. And so in a sense, we are borrowing money from ourselves as we go into retirement. And we do this in an attempt to kind of smooth our consumption over our lifespan so that we're not, we're not really poor and consuming almost nothing when we're young, and then consuming a lot when we make a lot of money, and then almost consuming nothing again once we retire and aren't making money anymore, right? We try to smooth our consumption over our life by utilizing borrowing and savings. And so what this leads to is basically when there's a temporary tax cut, we kind of don't respond to it because we're smoothing our consumption over our lifespan. And so any tax cut that we experience, it's kind of like the Ricardian equivalence theorem in a way. We kind of think that, oh, well, it's temporary, so at some point we're going to have to pay higher taxes again in the future. And since I'm trying to smooth my consumption, I'll just save that money instead of spend it. Okay, another possible offset to fiscal policy is called a direct expenditure offset. And these are basically any actions on the part of the private sector, so consumers and businesses, firms, any spending income that offset government fiscal policy actions. So basically what this leads to is any increase in government spending in an area that competes with the private sector will have some direct expenditure offset. Try to think of a good example here. So I guess one example might be if the government spends more money in education, for example, then a direct expenditure offset would be that private corporations therefore spend less money on education, right? So if the government boosts its spending on education, then the private sector would decrease its spending on education, and so there'd be a direct offset there. Okay, real quick, let's think about an international policy example. Higher government research and development generates a direct offset spending cut. So there have been economists that have found that improved profit performances of recipient research and development firms induce their competing firms to cut their own R&D. So when there was an increase in research and development spending by the government, routed through private companies, other competitors then reduced their own research and development, generating a direct fiscal offset. What if a nation's government were to find itself on the right of the top, to the right of the top of the Laffer curve? Okay, we haven't talked about this yet, but there's something called the Laffer curve. And basically, it's this idea that there is a trade-off between tax revenue and tax rates, at least at some point. All right, so here's the Laffer curve. Okay, so let's talk about this first before we think about that other example. So the Laffer curve is basically showing us a relationship between tax rate and tax revenues. And so the idea here is that at low tax rates, increasing the tax rate will lead to higher tax revenues. But at some point, continuing to increase the tax rate will actually lead to a decrease in tax revenues. And the main reason for that is that recall that a tax rate, right, on your income is basically a negative incentive to work, right? So as tax rates go up, you're less incentivized to work because the government's taking more and more of your money. So right here is basically a tax rate of 100%. The government takes all of your money that you earn. Well, if the government takes all of your money, you're not going to work because you don't get any money anyway, right? So at a tax rate of 100%, since no one works, no one earns any income, the government doesn't raise any tax revenue. On the flip side of that, if the tax rate is 0, there's a really high incentive to work because you take home all of your income. But since the tax rate is 0 and the government's not taking any of it, of course it's not raising any tax revenue, right? So what this implies is that there's some optimal tax rate where the government can maximize its tax revenue. Okay, so that's the Laffer curve. So let's go back to this example. What if a nation's government were to find itself to the right of the top of the Laffer curve? In other words, to the right of the top, so somewhere over in this region. Well, if that's the case, what should they do? They should decrease tax rates, right? So at this point on the curve, the tax rate is so high, it discourages people from working additional hours, saving and investing more funds, and encouraging engaging in productivity, increasing activities, right? There's no incentive to work harder and produce more because the government's just going to take a large chunk of your income. And so as a result, economic growth may decrease and the government receives fewer tax revenues than it would if it were to reduce the tax rate. Okay. All right. Another possible offset is referred to as supply side effects of changes in taxes. And this kind of relates to the Laffer curve. So basically, expansionary fiscal policy could involve reducing marginal tax rates. In other words, just income tax. Now, advocates of this approach argue that if you decrease the tax rate, it will increase productivity since individuals will want to work harder and longer, save more money, and invest more. And the increased productivity will lead to more economic growth. So this idea of reducing taxes to encourage economic growth is referred to as supply-side fiscal policy. Right, and as a result, lower marginal tax rates will not necessarily reduce tax revenues because the tax base is larger as a result of the economic growth.